Once man had a mind, it looked about and found that not all of life was a pretty sight. So, to protect itself, it decided, I'll think about it. What shell can penetrate such an armor? Only that of direct perception and understanding. The awakened mind can absorb all blows, being totally open, defenseless, and immune. You can identify the mystic's nudist colony by the sign that says, thought optional. In the beginning was fiction. And when man found this lacking, they brought forth non-fiction. And that about wraps it up. For most. No. In his humble, bumble attempt to explain his less than particularly brilliant behavior, one mortal mumbled, "I am but a simple man." And Life replied, "You could have saved your breath." Thought is like a spot on a three-dimensional watch, believing itself to be somewhere between noon and 2 o'clock. The trick is to grease up those hands, obliterate those numerals, bid adieu to internal time, which supports the illusion of proprietous preference, and think in a reality that has no limits or restraints. A man knocked at the door of a Zen monk's room, then entered and asked him, "How many koans are they?" And the monk replied, "Come in." Life in the collective, its cost and connection to the otherwise. If you identify yourself with some group, you base your individuality on that which is already spent. Out in the herd, every man's sense of self's composed of 98% memories, 60% of which never happened to him personally. The mystic's invisible college has a slogan, "An I is a terrible thing to waste on mere thinking." Over in an oblique reality was a certain Moses who did not lead others from some physical state of displacement back to a homeland, but rather attempted to dislocate himself internally from his place of origin to roam free in a new land that has no name. You can't have a kitchen floor until you have roaches. And you can't conceive of a clean one until you do. And a man asked a mystic, "Then how?" And he replied, "Don't ask me." How to identify talk when you see it. It's the stuff that multiplies even faster than roaches. One man suffered a headache for 30 years until he realized that it was his head. And the people sang, "We dream of a world without conflict." And they dream of a world without thought. Oh, we dream of a world without conflict. And they dream of a world that cannot be. A world without conflict would have two major features. It would be non-mental and it would be non-physical. From a more complex view, all human activities that are popular are failures. At no additional cost, you could ponder this as applies to thinking. Some jailhouse news. Everyone's being held under false charges. What happens when duality is exploded? Are you left with its fragments? No. You're left with a nothing. Under ordinary conditions, you can't describe red without blue. And under extreme conditions, you can't describe a more conscious condition, since it is comparable to no other condition. And under super duper extreme conditions, you can't even think about trying to. A man inquired of a Zen monk, "How many koans are there?" And the monk replied, "What is that number that comes after one?" The dumb keep saying the same things over and over. I mean, like continually. I mean, they'll just keep on repeating themselves till they almost drive you nuts, if you know what I mean. You know? One guy said, "I like the life I live, since there'll be no advertising in hell." And the spirit of surceases, long since gone, chimed in, "Not necessary, for in that wondrous land everyone will be involved in double-time thinking." The man pondered on this for a while, then asked the spirit, "Does that mean that you're tortured at twice the normal speed?" "No," the spirit replied, "at half." And at first the guy was relieved, until he began to think about it in a certain way. Symmetry is very important. Is understanding what's going on and not caring what's going on the same thing? While the latter naturally follows from the former, the reverse is not true. So much for cynics, smart alecks, and other social commentators. When the simple hear gunfire, they can't conceive of there being no specific human target. One day, in one place, local conditions said to the creatures, "You guys are dumb as all get out. As a matter of fact, why don't you get out?" One guy's head exploded. He did later admit that it was hard to tell. A robin told his son, "When you can hear the braying of an ass and not be irritated, then you are wise." And across the barnyard, a donkey was just saying the same thing to his child regarding songbirds. A man asked a Zen monk, "Do stories like that one convey a deep moral message?" And the monk saddled him. The simple put grease in their hair. The more enlightened, a bit further down, say a millimeter or so. What the mind ordinarily finds interesting, it does so generally from desperation. The dumb don't necessarily get dumber, but they do tend to get mad at the dumber. One day, one man said to life, "Now that I'm older, and I believe I know more, would you forgive all of my past offenses toward you?" And life replied, "You could have saved your breath." To the simple, fashion is an external matter, while to the more complex, as you might imagine, it is something else. Another description of the mental road to the expanded state of awareness that you might care to consider is the continual up-the-stakes form of thinking, wherein no explanation or analyzation over 15 seconds old is acceptable. Everyone has a twin sister or brother who runs alongside the car for most of your life. And often when they're bored, they'll hand shadow puppets on the wall to keep you entertained. A man wrote to a Zen monk with a question, "How many koans are there?" Only to find his missile to turn out to be a self-igniting letter bomb. One man thought that 3 was a magic number, only to have 2 turn him into a rabbit in a hat. Some courtroom news. Everyone's being convicted with perjured testimony. What is the difference between hot water, extremely hot water, and H2O at a boil? What is the difference between the brain, the mind, and fulfilled consciousness? One day, one guy thought, "Geez, I may be a dumb, sorry piece of work, but at least I ain't as dumb as life. After all, I never made a sorry piece of work like me. The simple celebrate simple things. The awakened, even simpler. Attention. You can't get pushy with thought, because it can push harder than you can. A boy asked a Zen monk, "What is the difference between talk and thought?" And to demonstrate, the monk shot a mime in the throat. Once you realize that all of human creation comes from man's mind, you can move on to the recognition that it comes through man's mind. After that, you might even see where it actually comes from. Classroom update. No one starts off with a clean slate. Papa, a boy asked his dad, "Is that why men want to bury the dead in spotless shrouds?" Everyone but the awakened know that when it's too late, it's too late. A boy asked a mystic, "Would it be cheaper to enlighten me or kill me?" And the wise one was impressed with the lad's sense of fiscal responsibility. No particular thought would be popular with a more alert man. Well, of course, obviously, save one. Ordinary minds make themselves obvious by discussing only the obvious, but without actually realizing what they're talking about. Bluntness is not a game for amateurs, nor direct perceptions the kinds of things a child should see. Life called out to man, "Well, speak up, damn it," and those who did were shot. Real men rarely make an appearance. Today's tip regarding the awakening to a higher, more enlightened state of consciousness. If you got to think about it, don't think about it. As he began to see the oil fields for what they were, one mystical wildcatter cried out, "Quick, cap those wells." It seems like that in some life, you and I were recently talking about how in the world of man's intellect, for the sake of discussion, insofar as we verbally separate it completely for the moment from his physical, bio-survival life, that everything man does, arts, religion, anything he does, that if you took away the intellectual aspect of it, it would cease to be what it is, then that's what I'm referring to, man's intellectual world. That everything he does is an effort to change his state of consciousness. And that all the ideas of some great mystical work, an enlightenment, a satori, an awakening, a mental liberation, a new level, a rebirth into a spiritual life, that all of this, as strange as the ordinary mind says that it is, as strange and exotic, as problematic, if not questionable, as the collective says that it is, and rightfully so, but as foreign as they believe it to be, it is as close to them as their Mr. Coffee machine. It is as close to them as their TV set. It's as close to them as whatever clothes they have that are fashionable as opposed to functional. Everything they do that makes them, in a sense, human is their own very simplistic, crude attempt to wake up, to be more conscious, to reach Buddhahood, to become a mystical Jew, to become a Sufi. If that's not strange enough, whatever they think is the strangest description of weird people, somewhere living off 1 grain of rice a year and sitting out nude in the snow in Tibet, they're at the same level, except they're even cruder than that. Because all of that is a continual effort to change one's consciousness. Because if you took man's, even though I said it didn't exist, it does exist, that if you took a neutral state of consciousness, if you took the kind of consciousness that I was using as an example, that the first moment when you awaken each morning from your nighttime sleep, which would be comparable to that moment just before the gods looked at Adam and Eve and Ken and Barbie and Abdullah and Fatima and everybody else around the world, that their God, just before their gods decided to give them a functioning intellect, that is, make them humans. Just that one moment when he said, pow, he sent out the logo, sent out the word, sent out the spark that ignited the nervous system above the thalamic level, beyond the limbic level in the brain, and went pow. For a split second, there it was, everybody staying life dead now, and for that moment, you could say, which I'm about to, you could say that there was a moment of uncommitted, neutral consciousness. Just but just like that, it be gone. Because you must have, to have a kitchen floor to begin with, you've got to have roaches. See, everyone thinks that roaches are some sort of affliction that you get once you have a kitchen floor. In other words, a good, normal, sane, sequential mind, not at all like you people. I was going to say no offense intended, but if you took any, then you deserve it. So, but an ordinary mind, if it heard that, would say, wait a minute. You've got to have a kitchen floor. That is, you've got to have a house, you've got to have flooring in it. You've got to have all that before you'd even have roaches. See, that's what's wrong with sane thinking. You do your own little cute follow-up to that. No. That's what's wrong with it. Because the truth is, you cannot have a kitchen floor until you have roaches. You cannot have consciousness and know it until you think about it, and then it's too late. That's the easy version. If you are afflicted with a kind of would-be Zen Reich, I guess. You've got this moment, you've got this potential. It is in man constantly of a kind of natural, neutral consciousness. I've given you 4 or 5 descriptions, and it's right there, but I can keep making up examples, pulling out examples from everyday life, but what you should really get from it is once I point out, like the moments I have to exaggerate and build up a situation, like right after good sex. I say good sex for the sake of ordinary thinking people who I keep hearing from the talk show newsletters that they say there's other kind, which for the once in my life almost makes me want to speak up to ordinary people and say, could I say a word? But I know better. Right after sex, or right after you've good physical exercise, right after completing perhaps a job, a kind of effort of which you had no previous experience, a job well done, something you did, be painting, music, repairing your roof, fixing a leaky toilet. But that kind of time when you get through and sit down, and people know this constantly, and I'm having to make up these examples because it seemed to have gotten some of you people's kind of nod or show of comprehension, that there are little moments that you come home or you sit down after something like that, and it's almost, I wonder what's on TV. It is unnatural. And me having to bring up the examples of after sex and etc., they are throughout a person's life, but you not only do you not notice it under ordinary conditions, even after such things that perhaps should be outstanding in your day, such as sex or a job well done or physical exercise, people ordinarily do not even notice that. And so they certainly do take no notice of the fact that it's like breathing. If you were a singer, it's like breaths between phrases. It's like breaths if you're a horn player. Or it's like the time, if the music has been, the copyist has done his job correctly, it's like the time that you've got a second to turn the page between playing a few notes. If you're, it's a momentary time out. It's almost, if you want it another way, you could even take the Hindu stories of the continual creation and destruction of the universe being Brahma breathing, inhaling and exhaling. Is it everything in life, everything in a three-dimensional reality that's run by polarized forces, you do not have white and black absolutely together. There has to be a line between it. You do not have inhalation and exhalation actually overlapping. It is, and there's a momentary pause. There's a momentary pause when your heart contracts and then releases. They do not, to a two-dimensional conception, to a two-dimensional awareness, they do not and cannot actually overlap. There is the reality of a momentary separation, a discreteness. That is going on continually in the human mind, and you take no more notice of it than you do the fact that you continually, every time you breathe, you momentarily die for a second. You momentarily stop breathing. You go, and just before you let it back out, there is just, it is so small, of course, you don't notice it, and it certainly does you no physical harm. It's simply the way things are. But for a moment, you quit breathing. A moment, if you look it up, is not a second. A moment is a figure of speech. You momentarily stop breathing. You momentarily stop thinking continually. I oftentimes try to do little demonstrations since it's so difficult to talk about. Well, it's easy to say the sentence. And you say that to people, and their ordinary mind goes, what? What? But I do little things like that. If you notice, sometimes after I'm reading a news item, after I've said something, I'll do a little something like maybe I'm dozing off, or it is a continual jerking, and you do not notice the moments between the jerks, which is you do not notice that moment of a kind of neutral state of consciousness between thoughts. What people do notice is me taking out the examples that of sitting down, it's like almost your mind goes blank. And it is almost then as though people shake themselves out of it, like, breathe, damn it, to change the illusion back to breath. That's when you just, your attention suddenly jumps to something. The newspaper, a book, TV guide, the TV clicker, the remote. You just stand up. You do something to shake that, to free yourself from that kind of no man's land of neutral awareness. Because to an ordinary man, it serves no purpose. It, in fact, if it is drug out, it seems to be, well, it strikes people as being uncomfortable, which was the basis of a little joke if I didn't make it plain enough. And of course, it wasn't supposed to be a joke, but that people will consult a psychiatrist, if not a friend, and say, my mind just won't stop and it's driving me crazy. And no one ever goes to a psychiatrist or turns to a friend and say, my mind has just sort of quit thinking and it's driving me crazy. If it happened, it would, but it doesn't, so they don't. It does happen under, it may have happened to some of you people, and you've certainly read about it or seen it portrayed in movies, people fooling around with psychedelic drugs and saying under those kind of unnatural chemically induced conditions that people have gotten high and will say, God, it's like my brain stopped. My brain's frozen. Help me, help me. And of course, it's not. As long as they're saying that, it's not. But what they are referring to was just before they said that, it's just sitting there, and it's, of course, qualifies as a bad trip as opposed to, well, it's a good one. It does, you know, a good one, suddenly you can worm your way into the atoms of the carpet on the floor and that kind of thing and see things you've never seen, think things you never thought. But a bad trip, one of the classic examples of a bad trip, is people that suddenly, as though their mind is about to stop. And that's as frightening, even though it's under truly unnatural conditions. But it is as frightening as it is, which also in those conditions, some of you may know, people say, I believe my heart's about to stop, which is frightening enough. Suddenly I became aware of my blood. I was almost conscious in the movement of my blood, which was weird. And then suddenly, it was like my blood had stopped and my veins wouldn't move. And I thought, I'm dying. That seems to be a physical base fear. But people have said, help me. I was having a good trip where I was beginning to see things, and suddenly it was like my mind froze. It is very frightening, very disturbing. But, men, that is not operationally foreign to everyday sane, non-drug-induced states of awareness, because men continually have it almost between each thought. It is almost as common as I said, a singer, you sing a line and you grab a breath. Your heart stops momentarily between each pumping, between each constriction. Your breathing stops momentarily between each in and exhalation. So it is unnatural, and yet people do it. It happens continually. And also notice, now let's expand the ball game, it's not the ball of whatever this is, that this is the very thing that is probably most common insofar as descriptions of what so-called mystical traditions claim the higher state of consciousness to be. That in some way it is that the mind has, they seem hesitant to use the word stop, which I'll give them credit for that, even publicly. They hesitate. But it's as though the mind no longer functions. It is not operating at the same intensity, with the same verbosity, with the same volume, with the same consistency. The classic example, again, is the old Zen one of the mind being as like the surface of a pond that is highly agitated by thought, by just random, uncontrollable thought, just the chatter of the mind. And it's the whole point of all of the Zen disciplines, all the many attempts to reach a higher state of consciousness, is to calm that, which is almost saying to stop the mind. So here you have the minds of ordinary people, of popes, presidents, your parents, ministers, rabbis, bricklayers, attorneys, just ordinary people who will quite naturally scoff at the very least, the idea of some higher state of consciousness, some altered state of consciousness that in some way is not drug-induced, is not a dream, is not brought about by belief in some higher power, is not brought about by the alignment of oneself to some physical, mystical rituals and exercises, but just something that people have done, that they just did it. They didn't do it through they didn't do it through inhaling weird smoke, they didn't do it through lighting candles, they didn't do it through praying. Well, they didn't do it through any way the ordinary mind hears the descriptions. They didn't do it through any manner that can be duplicated physically. That is, that they did not take something, some substance, and rub it in their pores, smoke it, swallow it, rub it in their scalp. It was not some drug. It was not something that came from an external source that they put in them that produced a state, because as long as that happens, the ordinary mind can absolutely dismiss it. But to hear that, no. There are things that is as natural in a sense. That is, they're as unaffected from external sources as your normal thinking. And the person says, all right, it is no stranger. It is the same electrochemical reactions that are running your brain right now. The guy goes, okay. There is a kind of state of consciousness that they're talking about, we could suggest to this ordinary person, that is not brought about through drugs. It is not some gift from God. It does not come about through a lifetime of meditation or attempt to chant a name or something to put yourself into a state of self-induced hypnosis or something. They go, yeah. It is, in a sense, as natural as the working of your mind right now, your brain, yeah, except it's different, intensified. It's just different, but it's on the same basis. As strange as it may sound, it is no stranger than what's going on in your brain now. That men absolutely dismiss. They won't even stop really to argue with it. It's like, well, you say that, But their mind tells them immediately that you're trying to cover up, again, for some kind of probably self-induced hypnosis, if not some charismatic guy has got you under his power, or that you've gotten nuts. You went crazy. You understand? Because the mind, as it reasonably should, the same kind of mind that runs technology and the progress of science, is that same mind that can look at the idea of a different state of consciousness through drugs, which the ordinary mind is more apt to accept that. Not that they would pursue it, but they're more apt to accept the claim of some guy saying, well, I've been taking LSD now for 20 years, and very often I feel as though I'm talking to the center of the universe, to an unidentified, I seem like I am in some kind of communication with actual physical vibrations that are running the universe. And an ordinary man go, well, I smoked a little pot, I tried a little LSD once back in college, or he may just say, well, I've read enough. I've read enough by men of a scientific bent that have played around with these drugs, and I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that you thought that. But then, see, they can dismiss that in the same way that they can dismiss people jumping up Sufis or snake-handling Appalachian Church of Godders, getting up and dancing around, whirling snakes, and somebody playing a bass drum, and they dance for 2 hours non-stop, and suddenly somebody falls down and seems to go into a trance, and later says they talk to God. To the ordinary scientific mind, they go, they can dismiss it, because it's obvious to the ordinary mind that that their claims to be in a different state of consciousness may well be reality to them, but based upon what they can see that was done in an extraordinary manner from their view. That is, well, you got hearing a bass drum played over and over and claiming that you wanted to talk to God to begin with, or the guy who takes the mushrooms, drinks the LSD, and knows what it's intended to do, he can dismiss them both on the basis, well, you did something. You took an external source. There was external agents at work that you put in your body, got into your brain, and for you to say that after that you believed you talked to God, or that you talked to the universe, or that you did enter into some extraordinary state of consciousness, your belief that you did, I do not doubt. And they don't have to be real sarcastic about it. They are saying what is reality to them, and properly so. They can dismiss it. What they cannot dismiss, and well, they don't even deal with it, but it's what I'm telling you, is the idea that people have done this, and that all of the normal activities, I'm talking about this ordinary person now, that all the normal activities of the ordinary mind generally finds to be extant and surrounding the events wherein men have claimed to enter another state of consciousness, such as dancing until they got dizzy, praying until they passed out, taking drugs. That they can understand, in a sense, why you say that, and they can dismiss it. But to say people have done and had experience in the same ways, or very similar to what these druggies claim, or what religious people claim they get through a lifetime of ritual and some sort of exercise, or else through the grace of God, there are people who do it without any of those attendant, observable influences. You understand? In other words, there are people who said they did it, and they got no story to go with it. They don't tell you how they did it, and they don't say, well, I took this, or they don't say, I did this. They say, I had another state of consciousness, and they don't tell you what caused it. The ordinary mind, it's somewhere past, when I said dismiss, they don't really entertain it. It's like, well, and the obvious, if you were trying to be or still insisting on being a street-level cynic or social commentator, then you would dismiss them as saying, well, they can't make head nor tail of it. It does not compute with their mechanical paradigms of reality, and therefore they just ignore it. Yeah, that's true, but that doesn't tell you much. All that tells you is that they're of ordinary consciousness. But so here you have the situation. You have ordinary sane men who are continually, I'm not exaggerating, and you can see it in yourself, you have almost breath by breath them being in an altered state of consciousness, at least in a state of consciousness that is not driven by a duality, a perception of a duality of reality. that they are not driven by thought, that they momentarily, they're taking breaths, they're a singer and they're taking breaths between each stanza, between each line, and for that 1 second, if it could be expanded and they had an interest, they have got the kind of cleared playing field, they have got the kind of place wherein Buddha consciousness could come in for a landing. Or they've got the kind of place wherein they could become super sane. They've got the kind of place wherein they could, if they knew how and had the interest, suddenly, if they could expand that continual, moment to moment, it was like they could suddenly now play super soccer because there's nothing in the way. They could see reality directly because there's nothing standing in the way of it. But it's not their desire, it's not their interest, and therefore it is ignored. And so look how far the field that is, how far away that is from ordinary consciousness, from ordinary minds, and then consider how far away it is even from people who believe that they're on a great lifetime, secret, mysterious, metaphysical, occult, New Age, hocus pocus, very secret, very mysterious journey. And my answer to all of those modifiers, which were in themselves claims, my answer is yes, yes, certainly, yes, yes, of course, yes, yes, and yes. That they're all correct. But how far away can it be? Oh, well, I was just thinking I was trying to calculate. So that was another demonstration. An ordinary mind said, oh yeah, I got that, sure. That cleared it right up. Well, let's try and apparently change the subject a little bit. Let me point out to you the power, the intrigue of the creative processes. That is, the power, the attraction that creative endeavors have to the people who have some talent. Artists, painters, writers, singers. And if we get around to it, in case you can't do it yourself, conversely, why the Philistines, that is, why people with no talent, seem to get, shall we say, somewhat, they have the propensity, given the least opportunity, to get somewhat irritated at artists. But what is the power? What is the intrigue? I was going to say that just at the ordinary level, we're not speaking now in any particular metaphysical plane or only a metaphysical plane, but a person sitting around, you can do it by yourself, which you've got to be able to get some enjoyment out of it, sans an audience, or you're not much of an artist to begin with. But that you can sit around and paint. Stay up all night and start sketching or drawing, or you're working on your symphony, or you're working on your great novel. Something that you seem to create. Even at the ordinary level, there is a shift between that and vis-a-vis an alteration of consciousness. I hadn't changed the subject that much. But there's a slight shift in that. Everything else I pointed out to you that ordinary people engage in continually, that is an effort to change their consciousness. Everything else, reading books, watching TV, watching movies, taking drugs, drinking caffeine, exercising, eating certain foods, meditating. Well, I shouldn't have said meditating in case we got simple-minded people listening or you'll get confused. All the things that people normally do to change their state of consciousness has what appears to be an external source that I will read to make myself feel better, or I will read about a higher state of consciousness, and I'll read books on mysticism because it encourages me to think in a certain way, or it gives me tips. It makes me feel better at times. Or at times I believe that just reading, in fact I know it does, at times I'll be reading a certain thing that Buddha said or Muhammad or somebody, and I'll read it, and I'll have to get up and go outside and walk around and slap my head and think, God damn it, I am so close. I am so close to it. That one sentence, whew, I know. But dig this. Consider this. All of that comes from what, by any reasonable appearance, is external to the person. It just simply is. Whereas, if you're engaged in that which would normally be qualified as a creative endeavor, it will alter consciousness. And again, I'm not now using it in any extraordinary manner. Right now, just really more or less the same level, let's say, the same general level as reading a book on art or going to an art gallery. You may say you like art or going to the symphony. You may say you like music and you have no talent, let's say. But you say, I go to the symphony and, I don't know, sometimes I enjoy it or whatever. You say you enjoy it. If you do, then it does alter your state of consciousness. And I refer you again one more time, ordinary people consider, if they took my term alter state of consciousness, they consider, well, yes, in a positive way, because sane people do not attempt to alter their consciousness in a negative manner. Even people when they drink, sane people who drink, if that's not oxymoronical, when sane, ordinary people drink, they do not do it to harm themselves. They do it for what they hope will be a beneficial result. It is a form of Russian roulette. But a person goes to the symphony to alter their consciousness. They turn on the radio to listen to music, to listen to whatever the latest popular music is, which may seem far removed from the symphonic realm, but it is still to alter their consciousness, and they consider, if asked, well, certainly in a good way, not a bad way. But someone goes to the symphony and says that they enjoy it. That is what it did to their mind. Forget all their descriptions about, well, Verdi always inspires me. Mozart makes me want to cry. Yeah. What it did was, it gave them something to think about. Not in the sense of specifically something to think about, but they were attempting to alter their consciousness back again, if you consider it, as opposed to if they knew what they were doing and wanted to enjoy themselves really. No offense to Herr Mozart or Beethoven or Rossini. But if they really knew how to tickle the mind, they would sit home and they would, the moment between the inhale and the exhale, the neutral state, they would grab that and just sit there. I'm not saying you would never listen to music again, but there is no music. And I'm talking about, we're down to the level now of Booker T, Groove Holmes, Wilson Pickett. We're talking about, as fine as it is, there's nothing like a blank state of consciousness. But men do not care for that. And so therefore they will go to the symphony. But still we're talking about sort of, this is a hand gesture to demonstrate. Now watch it. We're sort of at the same level. You see like that? That means the same level as that, as an ordinary person goes to the symphony. They go to listen to music and they say that they enjoy it. That is, they find it beneficial, or they wouldn't do it. It is not the same as someone sitting home with a ukulele, an accordion, at the piano, with a guitar, writing their own music. It is simply not the same. And we're not making, of no consequence, a qualitative judgment of the quality of the music, and etc. But I am assuming that the person has some talent. If they do, the enjoyment of sitting there, and they can just be sitting around throwing the guitar and just start fooling and just maybe accidentally hit, and for the first time in their life discover a diminished with a flatted 11th on top. And go, God almighty. Ooh. And they play it again. And they just, great fun. It's almost your own sort of internal Columbus. That kind of enjoyment, the kind of effect it has on those people involved in it, is beyond even at the gesture again. It's even beyond this rather routine level, but it's beyond the man going, the woman going to enjoy passively listening to someone else's creative effort. And the reason I was going to point out the power, the intrigue, and the fulfillment, the enjoyment that people with some creative talent have derived from their effort that is not available when you're a passive spectator, is that it closer approaches you affecting your own state of consciousness, and relatively speaking, from within you rather than from listening. Or from somebody sitting down and be able to write, whatever it is, but to write something and actually you enjoy it. And we're talking about that you enjoy it as opposed to it's getting into impossible divisions, of course, but when I say it, if you've got any real talent, you can enjoy some of what you do to some degree without an audience. If you're a human, you're still being run by the herd collective instinct, and you're still a mammal. I'm trying to cut back on the smart-ass comments. You're still a mammal. It is very likely and not a sin, but it's very likely that the next time you run across one of your friends who enjoys music, maybe plays guitar, you're going to show him that diminished with the flatted 11th and say, listen to this. Have you ever heard anything like that? And you go, or just listen. Or if you ever finish your song, you'll probably end up wanting somebody to hear it, to go to open mic night at some club. Or if you finish writing whatever it is you're writing, it's very likely you'll end up showing it to your husband or wife or girlfriend, or you may send it off to a publisher. We're not saying that, but if you have talent, the point is you can sit there and you can get more enjoyment out of sitting there alone in your room with a guitar and actually feel like you did something creative that night. You discovered a new chord, or you wrote a song that's the best work you ever did. Here it is, at that same level, we're still not into the mystical realm. But the reason that is so powerful among those who have talent is that, comparably speaking, to someone out listening passively in an audience to a symphony, to a rock concert, or someone reading a book, as opposed to someone who is actually writing, the enjoyment is not really comparable, because, relatively speaking, apparently the alteration in your consciousness is coming from within you rather than from out there. I mean, it's not that complicated, although I did a good job of perhaps of verbally making it appear otherwise, but that's my job. That was more fun, that the effect it had on your mind, although we all know that people do not normally think about it in this way, but there you are writing and finishing up a song, brand new song, or you finished up a chapter or just a good page of writing in your book. It's just been going for years, but just a good page, sometimes a good sentence. That just this sentence, and you really have to get up and walk around, go outside and smoke a cigarette, jump up and down, go talk to the trees, look up the sky. Even more so than somebody who may have been reading a book and read some great phrase that just almost floored them. As much as it's pleasant and as big an impact as the latter can be, the former is way beyond it. That is, of writing your own, just one sentence that, you have to go outside and walk around twice around the house, twice as much as someone who read something that affected them to the point that they had to jump up and walk around. And the question I was presenting to you rhetorically, which I answered in advance, is why this is, and why it is that they both they alter one state of consciousness, but in the case where you are apparently creating something yourself, it, relatively speaking, seems to come within you rather than from out there. It all comes from the same place, we might say. But rather than it being second-handed, rather than you being involved with cannibalism, it's like you're beginning to chew closer to the original meal coming from life. You're getting closer to putting your hands on the more direct energy that's just flowing up through you and up through here, rather than going up through somebody else and then coming to you. Coming through you is the collective. Coming through you is the herd instinct. Coming through you is the ordinary intelligence. To go through somebody else and then through you. That's the kind of net, that is the kind of invisible nexus that intellectually holds humanity together. That there is, beyond a food chain, beyond a food network, that obviously holds this whole planet together. We finally got humanity up to the point that some people are beginning to say, well, physically speaking, this whole damn planet, the whole life on this planet, we're beginning to seriously suspect that just about everything is physically connected. That even little birds or some little microbe, a slug that we never paid any attention to, that is now just on the verge of extinction, we suddenly see. Not enough of you sure about me having to make it up. But somebody says, we suddenly realize that this slug has been feeding such and such gulls over here. And these gulls have been spreading their droppings by picking up plant seeds over here, and they've been pollinating and dropping the seeds over here inland, 400 miles inland, which have been feeding a whole group of people. In other words, they're beginning to see that some, apparently, at first blush, some insignificant physical creature, some creature in the physical life of this planet, is connected in a way that within just 2 or 3 steps, you can see, is seriously connected to the physical health and well-being of humans, of bigger systems. So they're getting to that point. Do not hold your breath whenever you get to the point that I'm pointing out, which is not that hard to see. that there is likewise an absolute intellectual, or non-physical, but it's intellectual, biosphere, network, lateral, food chain. Or it's this gigantic net. It's just spread around the planet. It obviously is physically, or they're beginning to suspect it is, but there's also intellectually. And the way humans are tied together, the way that reality stays reality, the way that reality seems to stay stable, even though it changes gradually. And like the old story that at one time the intellectual people, the smartest people at any time thought the world was flat, which is questionable, but that's the great historical example. Or they believe man couldn't fly. They believe that, you know all the stories, reality changes, but it changes collectively. The sane reality. We're not talking about a guy who stands up, the first guy that went, hey, I bet man could fly. And everybody there in Milan went, yeah, right. Yeah. Reality is what the collective find to be reality. And that reality consists of energy that is second-hand, intellectual energy. Now, I've given you the description that physically and then intellectually, that the energy that runs everything, you don't have to take this literally unless you want to, is coming up through the planet, up through the soles of your feet, up through your nervous system, and it reaches its highest point on this planet, at least three-dimensionally, in the human intellect. That's the highest that the energy of life reaches on this planet in the 3D world. And it's got nothing to do with physical structure, obviously, because redwoods, if that was true, redwoods would be more conscious than we are. Trees would. This is the highest point that the energy in the planet, which does not originate there, but that's just, we've got to start somewhere. The energy here in this planet, the energy that keeps us alive, is coming up through the soles of your feet, right up through your nervous system, and it reaches the highest point in the human brain right here in the cerebral cortex. That's as high as this energy gets in a three-dimensional reality. But the way people are normally fed, what is collective intelligence, what is accepted by people ordinarily to be intelligence, to be reality, is this network wherein the energy your brain primarily gets is from the network. You understand, it's still coming up through your feet and through somebody else's, but every time you read, every time you listen to someone else say something, you go, that makes a lot of sense. You're getting second-hand energy. You're not being fed directly. It is not, you're not playing the sport of bluntness. You are not engaged in the direct perception of reality. You're not supposed to be. It's not necessary. What you're doing is like this, is your mind, in a sense, is continually checking. Am I still sane? What do you guys believe? What do you guys believe? But of course, that would be inefficient. It's not necessary. As I've pointed out in some of you, every now and then I get letters from all around the world that say thank you, that they finally seen the tape, and say that the one thing they got out of all this was the question about the rhetorical question, me saying, or pointing out that no one knows what they're going to say next. Maybe that'll be all I'm remembered for, that and my warm and charming personality. People do not know what they're going to say next for a very simple reason, because they don't know what they're going to think next. Of course, ordinary minds can't take the first one, so they're certainly not going to take the second one and grab it and pick up and grab the ball and run off the field and think, boy, I got something worthwhile now. They're going to try to get out of the stands. They're going to click me off and move back to nude rabbi wrestling. It is what is normally called reality, and I was going to tell you is what is the other level, the operational level behind such publicly remembered descriptions. The Hindu, the Zen, the Christian, throughout, but them describing that what we see as reality, what the ordinary mind says is reality, is not actual reality. That it's a form of illusion, is the way the Western world has translated much of the Indian and Buddhist writing, is Maya, the illusion, that the ordinary mind is distorted and it's all tied up with a chatter and all sorts of weird stuff, and therefore you get a distorted view of reality. That you may see it good enough to live, you could be a king, you can get rich, But what you're seeing is not actual reality. It's an illusion of reality. It's not the true perception of reality. But the reality behind their description is what I'm telling you. Is that the mind is constantly engaged, that without knowing it. It's operating just as fast as I'm telling you, as that momentary lapse, that momentary time of a neutral state of consciousness that is the human mind's at the ordinary level of Maya, of reality, what seems to be reality to all sane people. It's as though, when I say a net, you do understand it's like we're all intellectually, with an invisible thread, a line of communication, a line of energy flow, that from you, I know this spatially seems impossible, well, improbable. There's a line from you that touches everybody else in the world, at least every other sane person, but everybody else, and vice versa. And therefore, and you understand, like any net, and consider this net is covering the earth. Now, there's some distance, but it's a perfect covering around the sphere here. Every time it moves a little bit in one place, it moves something else. If you understand that everything, and there's 6 billion little intersections. Of course, it had to be more than that, but you understand 6 billion people. Every time that somebody thinks something, it affects a little bit everybody else. When you are affecting your consciousness, which we're talking about consciousness now, when I say you're connected up here, because we're not talking about the physical connection. That's becoming more and more visible, that even ordinary minds, as I said, are almost having to say, well, there's a lot of evidence that says everything is connected physically. Everything up here is connected. But what is the reality is this sphere, is this net. And the reality is the second-hand, the collective second-hand energy that is flowing up, and that you're continuous, as though you're checking yourself and orienting yourself, like, am I still sane? Does everybody still sort of believe this? But you're doing it just like that, just constantly. Therefore, that is the impossibility that I was going to get to, I guess, next time, of why it is almost impossible to ever think anything original. That's why it's almost impossible, once you begin to hear it, to ever hear anybody say anything unexpected. Now, not insane, which is another story I was going to point out, is why the sane find it so disturbing insane people, because they, in a sense, represent something closer to original thought than themselves. But that's another story, is that ordinarily, just listen. And quite sane, ordinary people, educated people, claim to be news junkies, for instance, claim that they will read every magazine, that they read 10 newspapers a day, and they listen to all the news commentators, that they read the latest books in history or politics or whatever. If you have any insight, if you can think with any more depth, that doesn't tell you how sophisticated or educated they are. It just shows how desperate they are. That's a nice way of putting it. It shows how dense they are. It shows what a super bad memory they have. Because all they're reading and hearing is what they've already read and heard. That if you had any kind of super memory, you can turn on any talk show, you can turn on any news commentator, you can pick up any book. I don't care the level of it. Well, we're not talking about scientific, of course. We're talking about what appears to be man's intellectual, social world. And if you had any memory, and indeed were sophisticated and educated, you can start reading a sentence and finish it. All you got to do is read the first 2 or 3 words, and if you can't finish it, you got a bad memory. You hadn't been paying attention to life. Well, you, sir, how long? There's man been, you're at least 40 years old, right? If you're 40 years old, or if you're 20, and by now you cannot listen to someone talk. We're talking about somebody important. They're interviewing the Prime Minister. They're interviewing the Secretary of Defense. They're interviewing the Secretary of the Treasury. And they say, well, what do you have to say? You're the one expert in this field. What do you have to say about what's happened today? And he says, well, there are a lot of things to take into consideration, but primarily, and if you can't finish that sentence, you haven't been paying attention to life. Because you're not going to hear anything that will actually change consciousness. You're not going to hear anything to make you actually go, whoa, whoa. Now, not insane. Not insane, because insane, it's like ordinary minds being able to dismiss the idea of another state of consciousness if they hear, well, the guy took drugs. Oh, well. But that's to hear, of course, this doesn't happen because life is looking after this net. But that would be like hearing they say, and here he is, our new Secretary of Defense, or maybe you've never seen before, here he is, the Secretary of War of some little faction that's fighting somewhere. And there he is, and the guy's got on a suit and tie, and he can speak a little English, and they ask him, well, what started all this? And he starts to sense it. Sounds like, well, we've been pressured by some of the superpowers here before. And suddenly he just says something absolutely insane. It doesn't happen. Okay, don't change the tape. Well, I'll pick it back up Monday, but that is the why for so long, in one sense, I've been beating around with being original and creative thought, is if you'll listen, if you want something to do over the weekend, who still has any of their brain cells functioning even at that level throughout the weekend, I'll have to excuse myself, I've been sick. No, I'm not. I'm going to get drunk tomorrow. No, I'm going to drink. If you begin to listen, everything in life is absolutely predictable at the intellectual level. If it is sane, it is predictable. And by that definition, conversely, that which is so despicable, that which is so questionable, that which is so disturbing in life to sane people is that which was not predictable. But they normally just identify behavior like, who would have thought that you could walk down the street to go into the 7-Eleven store and buy a newspaper, and out of the clear blue sky at 5 o'clock in the afternoon in our neighborhood, suddenly a guy walks up, held the place up, and looked at you and said, what are you looking at? And shot you in the head. They look at his behavior like, that is, to say that's disturbing is an understatement. But they find it disturbing on unexpected, unpredictable behavior. The really unexpected, which would be even more frightening, is why we just dismiss it or we lock people up.